Hi, everybody. Today's Wednesday, November 12th, 2025, and our dear friend, our brother Matt Ho is here with us. Welcome back, Matt.
Hi, Nima. Good to see you.
Matt, let me start with uh, what's going on in Venezuela. We're going to talk about Ukraine, but before going there, let's talk about Venezuela because CNN reported yesterday that Venezuela announces massive mobilization of military forces as the United States' largest warship sails into region. And before coming up, you mentioned the situation with the case of the war in Iraq and the situation in the Middle East and in West Asia. We had the same in Libya. What is your point when it comes to the Latin America and the influence that any sort of war between the United States and Venezuela could bring to the region?
Yeah, it's going to be metastatic, right? It's going to be malignant. It's going to cause, at best, instability, if not outright warfare. You look at any example, and if someone can think of one where this didn't occur, please put it in the comments. But I can't think of any example. Vietnam, the effect it has in Southeast Asia, say particularly Cambodia and Laos, Iraq, in terms of the effect on, say, Syria, Afghanistan, the effect on Pakistan, just as well as just a turmoil throughout those regions. You just brought up Libya. What we're seeing occur right now in sub-Saharan Africa is a direct consequence of NATO's war in Libya in 2011. You look at what's happening in, say, Mali or Nigeria, with the armed groups there. The way in Mali, they're able to blockade the capital from getting fuel, right? I mean, a decade later, and the consequences of Libya are still reverberating, are still rippling and having, this malignant metastatic effect. You could see that happen in South America. I mean, they've already said it, right? Machado, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the heir apparent to Maduro, if the United States is successful in getting him out of power. She has said, after you free us here in Venezuela, then you're going to free Nicaragua, and you're going to free Cuba, the designs by the Americans to consolidate their power in the Western Hemisphere as the United States in this administration accepts the multipolar world in a way that the Biden administration never would. But this administration, still an empire, it's still imperial, but it understands the changing dynamics of the world and trying to reshape or reinvent or reimagine the American empire to take advantage of that, to still be the preeminent or dominant empire. Well, they've got to consolidate what's theirs, and that's the Western Hemisphere. So you could see the machinations that would be put into play once the Venezuela campaign reaches a certain phase. Okay, now we have to shift. Now, we saw this in Iraq. I mean, my first year in Iraq in '04, spring of '04, when I was part of the Coalition Provisional Authority, so the Jerry Bremmer's outfit, the colonial administration of Iraq by the American Defense Department. I got there April of '04, was it May, whatever it was. So a little more than a year after the invasion, and you still had people at the CPA headquarters, so senior levels of American officials, who would speak in ways, who would say things like, the big decision is still whether we go right or left, meaning that in the spring of '04, you still had key people, senior people who were around senior people, saying things like, are we going to Iran next, or are we going to Syria next? And that's what we're looking at here with Venezuela. Machado's already said it, like I said, but this idea that what would be next after Venezuela. The other aspect of that is, as we were discussing before, Nima, this idea of what would this do to embolden or strengthen other movements throughout Latin America that are in favor of American alliance, right? Or in favor of being America's vassal, or seeing America as a pathway to their own power. That's probably the best way to describe it. So this idea that, say, like where you are in Brazil, you've already had a coup. You have these issues with right-wing groups there, with assaults on your democracy, you could very well see groups, throughout Latin America saying, you know what, the reason why Venezuela occurred, the reason why the Americans got Maduro out of power is because the opposition was so fervent. The opposition made noise, right? So the idea being is that the Americans are not going to take a chance on this. They're not going to risk it, or they're not going to deem us worthwhile of their support unless we demonstrate that we are worthwhile of their support. So you have this possibility then that if the Venezuela regime change war or operations or whatever they're going to do comes into effect, other groups throughout Latin America will say, this is the way for us to get to power. We have to demonstrate to the Americans that we are strong enough, we're resourceful, or that we have the resources, we have the ability to be worth their investment in helping us overthrow whoever it is, whatever country they're in. So yeah, this idea that you could have this increased instability is demonstrated through historical experience. It's demonstrated through the very words that are being spoken by both those in Latin America and those in the United States, and then by just the rational aspects of it. Yeah, it makes sense that this would embolden or strengthen other groups throughout Latin America to try and get the United States support to gain power for themselves.
At this particular time, Matt, do you see any difference between the establishment and Donald Trump himself and his administration? Do you see those? He came. You remember when Donald Trump was the presidential candidate, and he was arguing that the war in you mentioned the war in Iraq. He said that I was against the war in Iraq. That was totally false, but he's doing the same. He's not that different. Is he part of the establishment right now?
He is. He's part of the ruling class. Yeah, that's for certain. He just comes from a different sector of it. He's viewed by the clique that has run Washington, D.C. for a number of decades as an outsider. Even after a term as the president, they saw him as an outsider. But a lot of this, too, is because he took control of the Republican Party. He came into the Republican Party via his presidential run in 2015. If people recall, he actually ran the previous time, didn't get very far in it in 2011, for the 2012 race. But 2015, he comes in, he defeats 15 other wannabes for the president, and the Republican Party fights him. And here we are 8 years later or so, and he is in control of the Republican Party. He made the Republican Party his. So you have an aggrieved section of the conservative base in the United States, or not the conservative establishment, the conservative elite in the United States, that view themselves as being usurped. And this is expressed in the Never Trumpers and various things like that. We know mostly of the Never Trumpers from those who were part of the national security, foreign policy establishment, who felt that they were being usurped. That in his first administration, Trump was removing from power those who were benefiting most from the status quo of the American national security machine, right? Of the status quo of America's imperial footprint. That those who were going to, and that's where you see so many of the original Never Trumpers coming from. But at this point, Trump has made the Republican Party his own. And so that many of those who are no longer in control or part of or receiving the largesse of being the Republican elite establishment are against Trump. Now, that they're all part of the ruling class, though, right? They're all part of the elite or the establishment, or however you want to describe it. I mean, go back to the person who's probably influenced me most in my thinking on this, C. Wright Mills, a sociologist, a political scientist from the 1950s, who writes The Power Elite. And I encourage people to read that book. I think he wrote it in 57 or so, or 56. And if you read that book, you'll have a good understanding of how the United States operates now, how it functions, why decisions are made, how you can understand the ruling class to have divisions within it, but still be arm in arm, linked together on those things that are most important to the ruling class. So, Donald Trump does have a degree of separation from the Republican establishment as I've known it most of my life, as I understood it most of his life, but he is still part of the ruling class and still has to, we'll throw George Carlin into the mix right now and say it's a big club and you ain't in it. So for me, you, all the group people watching this right now, we're not part of that ruling class. And so even though there are divisions within it, we have to understand it as the ruling class that has its own cliques and its own internal hierarchies and stuff, but is still distinct and different than the rest of us.
I think you put it so cautiously and precisely. And Matt, let me uh, shift the gear to the conflict in Ukraine, because as we know, Russia is advancing and Pokrovsk is falling. And what else can Donald Trump bring to the table in Ukraine that could somehow change the game? What else Europeans can do in Ukraine to change the reality of what's going on in Ukraine? Because as time goes by, you see just Ukraine is shrinking. They're not going to expand. They're going to shrink more and more. And what is your understanding on the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, not just Pokrovsk, but it's in Kupiansk. It's on other parts of the front line that the Russians continue their advance. You have this continual disbelief or refutation or, by the West, that includes Ukraine, Europe, the Americans, the backers of this war, who deny that Russia is advancing. And Pokrovsk is not going to fall. The Russians are, and then all of a sudden it's encircled, right? And the Russians are in the middle of it. And yes, I mean, that took 18 months or however long, but we also understand that the Russian objectives in this war are not terrain based, that they are goal oriented, they're objective oriented, and those objectives are not terrain. It's the destruction of the Ukrainian military. It's the destruction of the West's industrial capacity to not the industrial capacity, but the continued destruction of everything the West produces. I believe in an attempt to make the West come to the realization that this is futile. You just had Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, the other day say that NATO is now producing more ammunition than Russia. I didn't see any details. I didn't see any evidence. Maybe they're producing more 5.56 rifle rounds. Something that the Russians themselves don't produce. It's some statistic that is true, but it's not true. But the failure of the West here to accept the reality, that the desire to remain beholden to this narrative, a narrative of the good war in Ukraine, right? A narrative of good versus evil, democracy versus authoritarianism. The thing that Joe Biden campaigns on. Let's remember that more than 2 years ago now, in September of 23, the Biden administration launches its first reelection campaign ad. And what is that ad? It is Joe Biden going to Ukraine. It's Joe Biden as a wartime president. We have to remember that the Democratic Party in the United States has used Russia as a boogeyman, has used the construct of Donald Trump equals Vladimir Putin, the Republicans equal Russia, as one of their main sources of identity, both who we are and who the Republicans are, for more than a decade now. That is very difficult to give up. That's very difficult to turn around on and say, this is no longer true. And I know the Democrats are no longer in power, but the same construct, the same narrative has been used throughout Europe, particularly in Germany and in Britain and France. It's very difficult for those political leaders to turn around and say, well, yeah, no, we were really too serious about this. We're going to make peace with the Russians now. They simply can't. They can't. And for many of them, it's the only thing that they're holding on to. Everything else is so terrible for them, whether it's issues of housing, the economy, healthcare, immigration, you name it. you have a Ukraine, of course, that is faltering, not just on the front lines, but economically, since things keep getting worse. There doesn't seem to be a way how they've come up with no way how they're going to fill this $70 billion budget gap to keep the government running. Keep it, as well as the United States has provided more than $50 billion to keep the economy afloat. And this Trump administration is likely not going to do that. And the Europeans haven't figured out a way to backfill that. And then you have the politics of it all. I just reading before I came on with you, this big corruption scandal in Ukraine where the justice minister and the energy minister are now out because they were taking bribes and kickbacks with regards to, and if anyone who's been following attention to Ukraine, paying attention to Ukraine these last, 3 years, know that Ukraine is now going into its fourth winter where energy is a major issue for the Ukrainian people. They're freezing at night because the Russians were blowing up the energy sector. But now you've got this on top of it. You've got, the Russians have been targeting our energy infrastructure for years now, making it so that life is miserable and hard for us. And the people at the top, the people running our energy sector, our government ministers, have been getting fat and rich off of corruption related to it. So you just look at this and you say, my God, what a mess. And so to your point, and I'm finally getting to it, of course, but to your point about what can Donald Trump do? Well, I mean, one thing he could do is call Vladimir Putin and say, hey, Vlad, this offer that you made to extend the New START treaty, let's do it. If people aren't aware, more than a month ago now, the Russians said, we'd like to extend the New START treaty, which is the last remaining major arms control treaty. This is what sets the caps on the number of deployed nuclear weapons each country has. It's very important. And more than a month ago now, the Russians said, we'd like to extend it for 1 year to give us time to negotiate a further or renewed treaty or whatever. And at first, Donald Trump said, that sounds great. And since then, we have not heard over the course of weeks any response to the Russian offer. So the first thing that Donald Trump could do would be to do that, to at least start this process of high level, grand strategy, talks, high strategic level talks that the Russians want, that the Russians, when you go back to what is this Ukraine war all about, it comes back to their defense. It comes back to their national security interests. It comes back to this idea of American missiles in Romania and Poland, right? So the same things that, Khrushchev and Kennedy were dealing with, this is what we're talking about. That's the first thing Trump can do. And if he did that, if he began this process of addressing the Russians' national security, their legitimate national security issues, concerns, grievances, that I think would establish a degree of trust, a working relationship where other issues would then be able to be addressed. But unfortunately, I don't see that happening. I see this belief that we can keep the Ukraine war going. Eventually, the Ukrainians are going to start drafting their 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds. That'll give us a half generation more of young men to feed into this furnace of war and keep it going. And Ruda is saying that we're producing more ammunition than the Russians are. See, it just took some time. It took longer than we would like, but now our factories and our plants, they're in gear, and this is just we're going to be an arsenal of democracy here in Western Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We got to figure out how to get the Ukrainians the money they need to keep their government and their economy from collapsing like the house of cards that they are. So we just got to figure out how to properly steal that money from Russian foreign assets, frozen assets, excuse me. Right. So you can see the mania, just the insanity that is present here. And unfortunately, I don't see any resolution to it.
The only win for Ukraine, in my opinion, is to end the war as soon as possible, Matt. Usually we talk about the resources, minerals, and all of these things, but in my opinion, the most important thing that any country has is the human resources.
Yep.
That is, the wars is all about the human resources being destroyed during the process of war. That what you look at the population of Ukraine before the war, it was 57%, 57 million, and today is 20 million. How the population is reducing, has been reducing during the conflict in Ukraine. And those people who, who immigrated to other countries, they're not going to get back. Ukraine
Right.
is not going to be on the same track that they were before the conflict in Ukraine started. It I don't know how these people are arguing they're helping Ukraine while looking at Ukraine today, they're simply dying before our eyes. And nobody seems to care about these young people who are being kidnapped by the Zelensky government to send them to the battlefield to be killed, assassinated, murdered on the battlefield.
Right. This reminds me, and I'm sure it reminds others, of the Americanism from Vietnam, that we have to destroy the village in order to save it. We have to destroy Ukraine in order to save it. The reality for the Ukrainians is that they are millions of people short to run their economy. 10 or 12 million refugees, both external and internal, in Ukraine in the last 3.5 years. The loss of Eastern Ukraine. So yeah, you talk about the decline in population. And then the real danger, Nima, that if Ukraine collapses, not just a military collapse, but a political or an economic collapse, or maybe all three, how many more refugees, right? How many more people are going to flee Ukraine? How many millions more that'll go into Eastern, Central, Western Europe, that will go to Russia, because Russia's absorbed, I think a couple million Ukrainian refugees. The danger then is that Ukraine is not just a failed state; it's a depopulated state. And what future? And what that then means for it also being a failed state that has lost, its working age population, is that it's also a state that is now possibly run by warlords. Because the reality is that despite this war, despite the goals of the Russians, I think in many ways it's proved counterproductive for the Russians, because you've had an increase in the political power of the right in Ukraine, the very people that the Russians want to get rid of or not see in power in Ukraine. They're the ones who've benefited politically over the last several years. Any dissent, any opposition to the right has been quashed throughout Ukraine. That's just not in politics, but that is in the media, in academia. The unions, right, have been suppressed. So you have this reality then is, okay, then who takes power then? If you lose Zelensky, then who is going to replace him? And it's going to be someone who is from that far right, who is someone that describe them as Nazis, right? That's who is likely to take power in a country that is depopulated, that has been ruined by war, that has, is bankrupt, but it's awash in weapons and men who are coming home from a lost war. Anyone who is listening to us right now, who is cheering on the idea of Ukraine being defeated, of Ukraine collapsing, you are asking for something that would be a nightmare scenario, a fascist bomb in Ukraine going off, essentially. If you think the Ukrainian government is bad now, what do you think it's going to look like when the country collapses, when the right fully takes power, when the country has nothing more than a leftover relic full of armed, angry men who lost the war? Right. This is why I've said before, but I'll say it again, why the Russian invasion was a strategic error. This is what they're going to get out of it. They're going to get that on their front, because, I understand the idea of getting neutrality, and I understand the idea of NATO encirclement. I fully agree with all that. I understand it. It's just my estimation is that this is what's going to be produced instead. So rather than getting a neutral Ukraine, rather than getting a pullback of NATO forces, of American missile systems, etc., pushing back the encirclement of Russia, you're going to get something that is wild and chaotic and unstable and unknown. You're going to have an Afghanistan or a Syria on your border rather than a NATO nation.
Yeah.
Both are bad.
Yeah. What we've learned today from the member of European Parliament, Sandra Gomez Lopez, here is what she said about the difficulties that Europeans are feeling in terms of the financial, the situation with the economy of Europe. Here is what she said, man.
And its families are faced with a very complex situation: climate crisis in the housing sector, increasing inequality, lack of competitiveness, and a war. And we are supposed to respond firmly, focused on the individuals, but the Council's proposal is a proposal of cuts. Why? Why? Because there is no money. There are not enough resources. And that is a clear sign of the fact that if in 2026 we can't make ends meet, we can't possibly keep the same financial framework up to 2034. It's outrageous. We need to be more ambitious, and we need to support the increase in the financial framework.
Yeah. Then you want Europe, with this current situation, you want them to help. Donald Trump is bragging that Europe is buying the weapons to send them to Ukraine. But what's happening to Europe?
Right. I mean, about a month ago, Nima, you showed that clip of Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the EU, giving that press conference where they just had a meeting or a conference or whatnot. And she says the two priorities for the EU are going to be building our armies and winning the war in Ukraine. You just listen to this last clip and all the problems across all of Europe. And the priority for the EU is going to be building armies and winning this war in Ukraine, a war that can't be won. And so you could just see this crisis in Europe deepen. And this is why reform is polling at 30% in the UK, right? This is why the AfD is doing so well in Germany. Politicians, the parties in Europe are, we were talking about this earlier, so tied into their own identities. This idea that they are the ones who are fighting tyranny because that's the only identity they have. They've failed their people. They've failed to invest in their countries over decades. These are the establishment parties. So whether they are conservative or liberal parties, they have all failed. And this is why you're seeing this desire by so many Europeans. And you can make the same case. We talked about this last week with Mamdani in New York or whatever, even Donald Trump. Why Americans or Europeans are looking for something else, anything that is offering us a relief from this corrupt, this corrupt establishment that has ruined us. It is. It boggles the mind that the European Union, which from an American perspective, or our kind of thoughts on Europe is that they're, they'd be more evolved or sophisticated, or they're not so interested in war and, more involved in taking care of their, running their nanny states, as we derisively call it here in the United States. And the reality is they're not, and they haven't been. And they've been carrying out neoliberal policies that have ruined Europe, just as they've ruined the United States. And there's no end in sight. In fact, it's even worse because the extension of those neoliberal policies result in militarism. And this is what should be expected, though, right? I mean, this is the how the empire goes. A capitalist empire, is going to eventually start eating itself when the resources from other places can't be consumed. And that's what essentially you have here. You have both the United States and Europe consuming itself in order to feed, the empire, to feed the imperial ambitions. It's certainly, I'll just say this, there won't be a dearth of things for you and I and all the rest of the folks who come on your show to talk about, because this mindset, this mania, this insanity, there's no stopping it. They won't even give it up, even though the poll numbers are such. right? I mean, like you look at the UK or Germany, even though it's so clear that the public rejects this militarism, that it's rejecting the neoliberal policies, the corruption of the establishment of the last decades, they still won't give it up. They still won't give it up.
Yeah, exactly. You know what's so amazing to me, that they were concerned about Germany. Here is what Politico reported. It says that Germany's push to become Europe's dominant military power is raising concerns in France. You know, it's unbelievable. You know, they're making the case. They say, so if Germany is rebuilding its military, we have to do something bigger than Germany,
Right.
because that would be usually.
Right.
This is a wrong path. This is the end for, Germany's economy has been destroyed by the war in Ukraine, and nobody's concerned about that. They're arguing that we have to build a bigger military. That's why we have. What is that, Matt? I
Right.
don't see. I don't know what was the idea of European Union. It was, as Paul Kerr-Roberts said, that the United States wanted to somehow control Europe, and or they were thinking that they can have some sort of understanding. Europe's history is full of war, Matt.
Yeah.
They were fighting each other for many and many years, and it seems that the war in Ukraine is just reigniting what was the reality of Europe in history.
Yeah, it certainly is amazing. I do think the EU, like the United Nations and other international institutions and agreements and efforts, come from aspirational places, come from the ruins of the Second World War. I mean, more than 50 million people were killed. Entire nations were destroyed, literally burned to the ground. And the idea being was that we have to unify, that we have to work together. We cannot allow um, divisions that are, I go back to what T.H. White said, mankind's destiny is unity. Otherwise, we'll end up in the trees throwing shit at each other like the monkeys. And I mean, that's what we're looking at here. But here we are, this generation of political leadership, and it doesn't begin recently. I mean, this begins right with the Brits. You go back to Thatcher. Yeah, I mean, but the desire to utilize the state to ensure the continuance of the status quo for the ruling class. I mean, that's no surprise. But the fact that it comes on the living memory of the destruction of World War II is still shocking. It's still something to say, wow, the Europeans are turning their back on what's in living memory. And that's what they're doing. And this militarism, the path only leads to destruction. In their own history, it's shown that. So, I mean, God help them and God help us all, because it doesn't seem that there are off ramps for this, only through the desperation of the public, of the citizenry, to look to groups like Reform or AFD. And we also know where that goes. When you start going towards reactionary populism, a lot of people get hurt. Things don't advance. You go backwards, and it's feeding the worst instincts of who we are as people. And it erases everything we've accomplished, all we have progressed for, all we've fought for is erased when we embrace reactionary populism. So, I mean, here we are, similar to I was describing with Ukraine, where the outcomes that we can foresee are terrible. I think the same for Europe. The outcomes that are either ruination by militarism, because the ruling class is afraid of giving up the status quo, or ruination by reactionary populism and going down that path, And the historical examples of that are plenty. And then we could talk about the United States as well, because I think there's the United States is different, I think, in some ways, but I'm not optimistic about the U.S. either.
Yeah. We had Al-Jolani Al-Shara coming to the United States, and he went on Fox News. He went on Fox News. He had an interview, and he was asked about his past, and he didn't regret anything. He said, "I was 19 years old, 9/11." And uh, what, Matt, when it comes to Al-Shara Al-Jolani, it seems that they're repeating the same mistakes that they have been, repeating and repeating time and time again. Is that the same case? Do you see somehow it's gonna blast, it's gonna explode in the face of those people who are trying to make something in Syria? Because I don't see, this guy is not capable of doing anything, without Turkey being behind him. Even, I don't know if you saw the video that Robert Ford is talking about how Al-Jolani was prepared for his position in Syria.
Yeah.
He was called by MI6 and to prepare him to teach him. I don't know what was the process of teaching him, but it seems that he somehow he learned something, but he's not, because if you were smart, you would say, I would regret why I've done before with those, horrendous activities with but he didn't say anything like that.
Yeah, he has to be careful. Sharar, he has his bases still Al Qaeda. They don't call themselves that, but that's their worldview. That's what they fought for. Many of them for decades, just like him. And so I think they will allow his attendance with Vladimir Putin or with Donald Trump. They recognize the realpolitik of it, right? The requirement to do so. But there are certain things that he can't go past, right? There's certain transgressions he can't make without fear of losing the support from his people, right? From that jihadist Al Qaeda base, that revolutionary base. I don't. Yeah, your question, Nima, about will this blow up like so many other United States endeavors, whether it's our man in Saigon, our man, Pickett, right? So our man now in Damascus. I don't think it blows up and affects the Americans in a strategic way, other than the continued instability through the Middle East, and then, of course, in the continued erosion of trust and confidence of the American people in their government. But that's just that's a continual tale. That's an enduring, that's just an enduring storyline here at this point. So for the United States government to align itself with the Al Qaeda boss, Sharar or Al Jolani, whatever you want to call him, it's how it operates. It's how the machine moves along. It makes sense. What are the other options for them? I mean, you and I and folks watching, we can come up with 100 different options rather than put into power and then keep in power Al Qaeda in Damascus, particularly with our decades-long experience having to fight the results of that, whether it be comes out of Afghanistan, whether it be what comes out of Iraq, the reality of the Islamic State around the world. Now we're talking about going to fight Boko Haram or the Islamic State in West Africa and Nigeria. I mean, but the man who's Al Qaeda in charge in Damascus, he's showing up at the White House on the 250th birthday of the United States Marine Corps, and that is just how the empire operates. That's just the reality of the American empire. That's just what comes with imperial bureaucracy and mechanisms and mechanics and the reality of it. Yeah, I mean, it certainly could blow up for the Americans. The understanding for them is that this is our man. He's going to work with us. He has to be very careful, Sharar. He can reference was it Dawood, who was the prime minister in Afghanistan, who overthrew the king, but who at one point said he tried to play both the Soviets and the Americans off of one another. And he used to say, I light my American cigarettes with a Soviet lighter. Saw what happened. I mean, decades later, look at Afghanistan still. So Sharar has to be careful about trying to please two bosses. And I shouldn't even say two, because you have the Turks, you have the Russians, you have the Qataris, you have the Americans, and then the issue with the Israelis, the issue with the Kurds, the resistance from the Druze, the Alawites, the Christians. I mean, this is an absolute mess, for lack of a better term, that could explode just as it exploded 14 years ago. So, it's remarkable too, because as we go through this, as we try and to articulate it, and in my head, I'm thinking as well about Lebanon. I'm thinking about Iraq. I'm thinking about Yemen. I'm thinking about, all these other, not even as mentioned Palestine, the reality of the Kurds in Turkey and in Iran, how complicated the region is, and how you can't tell one story without having to allude or mention or put an asterisk next to explain all these other stories. Lebanon, in the reality of what has been occurring in Lebanon for decades, but say in the last year or so, people probably read the Israelis are putting up walls in southern Lebanon. So certainly you have these states that are colliding in these countries, and what will come from that? History tells us that it will explode, that this much friction between these states with the competing interests, it's going to be a spark, it's going to be incendiary, and it's going to be an explosion. And so, certainly those who say what we've seen the last 2 years in the Middle East is only the opening chapter, I fully agree with them. I fully agree with them that regardless of this idea of normalization with Saudi Arabia that may be coming, or American defense pact with Saudi Arabia, and this, that, the other thing in terms of the Israelis are working with the Qatari and the Emirati and the Saudi militaries at time. And, great. The ruling class in those countries, the despots in power, right? The genocidarians in power, they get along. Big shock. It's all at those levels below where you could have this, again, explosion that will give the meat of the history, right? That will provide the bulk of the chapters to the history books about this era we're in.
Matt, what's your understanding of the new air base close to Damascus that Donald Trump wants to send troops there? And what is the reason? Is that, are they going to put, I don't know, air defense systems there to defend Israel if something happens between Iran and Israel?
It's very possible that could be part of it, right? Maybe as they have looked back in the last year or so of the war, of the battles between Iran and Israel, they have seen that here's a gap, and we need to put something in this gap. Possibly, I don't know. That's speculation. What this base would look like, what its purpose is, again, we can speculate. The reports say they did land aircraft there to test the runways. Well, okay, that means, but at the same point, the Americans not going to want to have a base that they can't self-sustain, let alone like retrograde from or retreat from if they really need to. So the idea of like them landing C-130s at this base near Damascus may just be for nothing other than logistical reasons. Can we do it? Or it may be, this idea of, we want to actually have a full-fledged air base next to Damascus. And, I don't know. And the same, there's reports that the United States is going to build a base on the border of Gaza. Whoever had on their bingo card, Donald Trump as true isolationist, or the United States is abandoning in the Middle East, that card didn't wing you anything. That's not what's happening here, as you can see. And, this is what an empire does. This is what again, no matter how the Trump vision for the United States differs, for the American empire differs from Biden's and Obama's and Bush's and Clinton's and so forth, in terms of his need to preserve the United States as the sole empire, right? As the sole superpower, as the unipolar power, the American hegemony. As much as that differs, where Trump, I think, correctly understands that we are in the multipolar world already. And we have to shift, we have to adapt, we have to reinvent or reimagine the American empire in order to not just succeed, but prevail in this new world. Well, it still means the American empire needs territory, it means terrain, but it doesn't mean it's going to occupy everything because it's entitled to, right? Which is the way his predecessors saw it. So, this idea of expanding military presence into Syria, into the border between Israel and Gaza, I should say, into the occupied territory there, coming at the same time as the United States is pulling troops out of northeastern Syria or relocating troops from Al-Assad Air Base in Anbar province in Iraq to Erbil, right? This is the reality, I think, of the map of the chessboard, if you will, that pieces have to be rearranged. You have a much more flexible, fungible world order that the United States has to be not reactive to, but adaptive to, and also and not just reactive, but proactive. And this is a hard pill for many American foreign policy elites and operators to accept. Most of the American foreign policy establishment are acolytes or disciples of Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. They view the world as a chessboard. I just referenced it. I don't even view it that way, and I just used that, right? So this idea that we're giving up, and also too that the whole doctrine of American supremacy, particularly since the end of the Cold War, that any threats must be disposed of, that there could be no challenge to American hegemony, there could be no challenge to American supremacy. Well, we're giving up on that, but we're not really giving up on it. This is not an American retreat by any way. This is a reinvention, a reimagining, a reordering of the American empire in order to ensure the American empire dominates in the future, and that it's just not one of many empires. And that's giving a lot of credit. That's attempting to see some method in the madness of Trump's foreign policy, trying to see a grand strategy there, which I think is there. And other commentators are saying similar things. But there's also still the reality of the Trump policy, where it still is, determined by how he feels during the day. It's still determined by his personal grievances. It's still determined by his desires. So, right, I'm gonna, bail out I'm gonna send $40 billion to Argentina to help my buddy Milei win the election, or I'm gonna put tariffs on Brazil because you put my buddy Bolsonaro in jail, or I'm gonna win the Nobel Peace Prize, so I'm gonna force Netanyahu to do something. There's all that, and the ideologues are still there, right? Rubio, Waltz, Rubio, Waltz, all the other Scott Bessent, all the other figures running the American government. So there are all these other factors still in play, or Stephen Miller. All these other factors in play that
Stephen Miller is so important, Matt. He's
so
behind
important.
the scene, but he's so influential, important character within the Trump administration.
He is. I can't name one previous Homeland Security advisor. I think Susan Rice might have been, or someone like that at one point. But it was never of anything of importance, and certainly not to the stature of the National Security Advisor, which is essentially what Stephen Miller appears to be. He appears to be, as the Homeland Security Advisor, a co-equal of the National Security Advisor. That is astounding. That is a true change in American policy, a true change in how the Americans formulate their policies and carry them out. And Stephen Miller is so important. He's just not running and controlling in the mind behind this criminal, unconstitutional pogrom against migrants in the United States, which also is causing the beating and the humiliation and the arrest and detainment of American citizens and legal residents as well. That's just not his only gig, his only shift, right? I mean, he's also fully involved in the operations in Latin America. This is just as much his thing as it is Rubio's. Yeah, I mean, Miller's importance we can't we have to continually bring up.
Yeah. Matt, before wrapping up, looking at the situation in the Middle East and Donald Trump, before coming up, we were talking about the Epstein files. And as we see, the new documents show that all Donald Trump's name is all over the documents. They're talking about Donald Trump. But many people were, many people were talking about that maybe one of the reasons that Donald Trump is supporting Netanyahu is because of the Epstein files. But here today, we've learned that Donald Trump has sent a letter to the president of Israel to pardon Netanyahu.
Yeah.
What is he so much in this sort of mood to support Netanyahu? What is he gonna get from Netanyahu that he's so much insisting on pardoning Netanyahu? Because he was asking during his visit to the Knesset, he was asking the president of Israel. But right now, it seems that he's trying to officialize, just make it official, to send a letter to the president of Israel. What is this all about, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think there's a kinship there. He sees in Netanyahu the same person that he is. There's this reality that Donald Trump does value relationships. He puts a high priority on his relationships. He'll abandon people if need be, of course. But, I think there's also as well the influence of Miriam Adelson. Her and her late husband gave $500 million to Donald Trump's campaigns and to the Republican campaigns over the last decade. She's looking to give $20 million to defeat Tom Massey, the great libertarian out in Kentucky. Right. I mean, there's, I think, some darker, if you will, or more transactional aspects to this. I think that Donald Trump views anyone else in power in Israel as not as reliable as Netanyahu. And I know that sounds paradoxical. That sounds completely crazy. But I think that his vision of the Trump Riviera plan for Gaza requires Netanyahu to be in power. And if you look at the way that the Americans are going forward with their efforts in Palestine and in Israel, it's through Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Trump's real estate buddy and his son-in-law. This is a very personal thing for him. And so I think the idea of, for lack of a better term, them getting his cut, getting what he sees as his tribute or his booty or his gain from Palestine, from his efforts to end 3,000 years of war, as he falsely and erroneously described it in that letter to Herzog. So I think a lot of those things all mingle together to see Netanyahu as someone he has to bail out. I think he also maybe sees it as a way to increase his leverage with Netanyahu. But he views relationships as a priority oftentimes. Again, we just brought up Milei, we just brought up Bolsonaro. So I think the same for Trump. He likes the idea of having these bilateral relationships, of having these ties with other leaders. And you see that the way he is so affectionate to other leaders, even ones that he doesn't agree with or doesn't see alignment with or has criticized previously, he will be effusive in his praise with them, particularly when he's with them. Or there's others too that just, I think, share his worldview. Viktor Orban is one. I really think that Trump admires him, right? Even whether it be in Asia, the Chinese or the North Koreans, I think he does have an affection for how they rule. and wishes that he himself, I know this is getting to some of the Democratic Party talking points now, but I think there's some truth there that he does wish that he didn't have the restraints of a democratic republic. Not that he minds them or cares for them or shows it any respect, but I think he did wish he didn't have the restraints he does have. I shouldn't even say wish. I think we know that. So I think there's all those reasons why you saw this letter today from Netanyahu to Herzog saying, "Hey, stop this lawfare against my buddy Netanyahu." And again, he sees himself in Netanyahu's shoes, right? And maybe he does believe that Netanyahu has been set up, that this is all rigged, that this is similar to the witch hunt, as he describes it, that he went through over the last, many years.
Yeah. Actually, he said that to JD Vance. You remember? He was talking about the way he was asking, the people around the president of China. He was asking the vice president. I don't know. He said that none of them was responding to Donald Trump. He said, but if someone asked me something, JD Vance would come in and would answer the question.
Right.
JD, you have to be more like the Chinese, Yeah, there is the reality, I think he really feels that he needs to be such powerful to, and he doesn't like the people shining around him.
No. And I'll say this, John. Have you seen the film about his early life, The Apprentice, with Sebastian Stan? It is, I thought, was an excellent movie. I'm not a biographer of Donald Trump by any means, but I grew up outside of New York City. I've been familiar with this guy my entire life. I thought that depiction of Donald Trump in that film, The Apprentice, explains him very well. I felt that after watching that, I understood the man and his decision making better than I had beforehand. It also shows that his patriotism, if you will, is not opportunistic. It's not something he developed when he decided to run for the presidency. This is something he had when he was in his 20s, and he was talking about the Japanese are screwing us over. They're taking advantage of us. Why are we bending over for these nations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is something he's long believed in, as well as, too, we're just describing his relationships and how important they can be to him, but then also how he can turn on people as well. And so I encourage people to watch that film, The Apprentice, if they haven't. Like I said, I thought it was a very good explanation of Donald Trump as a man, and as to as to his worldview and why he makes decisions the way he does.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Matt, for being with us today. Great
Thanks,
pleasure,
Nima.
as
Yeah,
always.
thank you, Nima.